And I'd like to thank the Zoo's Conservation Committee for inviting me to give this talk, and thank all of you for being here this evening. Before I get into the talk, I'd like to thank some of my colleagues, Alan Franklin of the National Wildlife Research Center, Mark Higley, biologist with the Hoopa Forestry, Jeremy Rockwhite, who has worked on our demographic study in the past, but is now at Oregon State University, Zach Peary, the University of Wisconsin, Angela Rex, also previously with Colorado State University, but now working with Zach through University of Wisconsin, and Keith Green Diamond Resource Company for their support and sharing the data. I'd also like to give a big thank you to Dr. Rocky Gutierrez, who was the principal investigator for several spotted owl studies back in the day through Humboldt State University. He hired me initially in 1992 as a seasonal worker, and then hired me full-time in 1994 to work on the Willow Creek study. And so he's responsible for my being here right now. Okay. All right. What I'm going to talk about tonight, I'll give a little background on spotted owl demographic studies, talk about the barred owl invasion and some of the impacts barred owls are having. I'll talk about the trends in the barred owl populations, get into a little bit about the barred owl removal experiment and the barred owl management strategy that was released last year. And then I'll also talk a little bit about other threats that the spotted owls are facing. So for our, there have been 3 spotted owl demographic studies locally. In 1985, Alan Franklin started the Willow Creek study, which is part of the Northwest California demographic study. In 1990, Green Diamond began studies, and in 1992, Mark Higley began studies on Hoopa, all following basically the same methods. Barred owl monitoring using barred owl specific calls began in 2009, and in that year, Green Diamond initiated a pilot study on barred owl removals. Barred owl removals were initiated on Hoopa in 2013 as part of the Fish and Wildlife Service large-scale experiment. And most recently, barred owl removals were begun on the Willow Creek study area and Six Rivers National Forest in the fall of 2023. All 3 of these studies have been part of spotted owl demographic meta-analyses every 5 years up through 2022. And the Northwest California study, which the Willow Creek study area is part of, has been part of long-term monitoring set up on the Northwest Forest Plan. Recently, monitoring under Northwest Forest Plan has switched to passive monitoring using autonomous recording units. So we're no longer doing field work on the Willow Creek or the other areas. Hoopa and Green Diamond are still doing their spotted owl monitoring. For the demographic studies, we tracked marked owls annually to estimate life history traits. For each individual we located, we determined their sex, age class, their pair status, and their reproductive status. And we used information gathered to estimate things such as survival, recruitment, and population trends using demographic modeling. So there's a lot that goes into the modeling, and I won't get into that, but one important thing I want to point out is they do incorporate imperfect detectability, so that if there were a few owls we didn't detect in a certain year, they still got accounted for if we detect them later. Some examples of doing the field work. In the upper photo, note there's a color band on the right leg of that spotted owl. And any unbanded owls that we located, we captured and fixed both a metal numbered band and a colored band on the opposite legs of the owl. The color band allowed us to identify individual owls from year to year. There we go. Field crews would go out and locate the owls and observe their behavior, collect information on habitat they were in, whether or not they were nesting or had young. This is on the Willow Creek study area, fairly typical habit inland with open understory, but a fairly closed overstory. The large picture on the left is an overview of part of the Willow Creek study area, showing the fairly dense forest and the steep terrain we worked in. And for those that are familiar, that's the treated Alps seen in the background. Ooh.
What?
Whoa. The photo on the right again shows fairly typical habitat inland, which is dominated by hardwoods with typically a conifer overstory. And that's Angela Rex attempting to identify a spotted owl using binoculars and a spotlight. Sensitive. Barred owls were historically only in the eastern U.S., but there's been a rapid invasion of barred owls over the last 6 decades or so. This is a set of maps from a publication by Long and Wolf. Each map starts in 2010 and shows barred owl detections up through a specific decade. Barred owls were first detected in Washington in the 1960s and in Oregon and California in the 1970s. I believe the first record in California was 1978. And they continued to expand both in numbers and in range. By 2000, they were occurring throughout the range of the northern spotted owl and starting to occur in the range of the California spotted owl and the Sierra Nevada. It's likely that they moved west of the Great Plains with an increase in forested areas due to impacts of European settlement, including fire suppression, planting of trees, and killing off most of the bison herds. The barred owl was identified as a potential threat when the northern spotted owl was listed in 1990. But at that time, there was little information on the specific effects barred owls were having on spotted owls. In the revised recovery plan in 2011, barred owl competition was identified as a significant threat to northern spotted owls. So this is not a recent issue. In California, there were fairly no numbers of barred owls detected until after about 2000. This is a map from the California Department of Forestry. and might be a little hard to see some of the colors, but detections in the 80s are shown by light orange dots, and there's a few up there. In the 90s, detections are shown by the light green dots, and there's quite a few more. But then after 2000, detections are shown with the blue dots, and there's quite a few more of those. The clustering of those detections you see is mostly because of detections during spotted owl surveys where barred owls were recorded, and they weren't necessarily being looked for in other areas, but they were probably throughout most of that area. Okay.
Sorry, it was also being funky.
There we go. Barred owls can have various unspotted owls, including reduced response to surveys, thus determine occupancy by the spotted owl. Interference competition with barred owls typically being the dominant species. Competition for resources such as habitat, prey, and nest sites. Barred owls nest more regularly and earlier in the season in Spotted Owl Zoo. I remember reading, on average, barred owls, pairs of barred owls will nest 80 to 90% of the years, whereas for spotted owls, long-term average is more like 50 to 55%. Hybridization does occur, but it's a very low rate. However, hybrids can compete and interfere with spotted owls as well. Interference competition was studied by Nick Van Lannen in this area using a playback experiment with recordings of both barred and spotted owls, as well as models to see how each species would react. What he found is that barred owls respond more often and with higher aggression to spotted owl calls at a model than spotted owls do to a barred owl call with a model. This indicated it could result in reduced occupancy or a shift of the spotted owls away from their main habitat. Okay. David Wiens conducted a large study with others in Oregon looking at competition between the two species. This is some of the results he published showing overlap between home ranges of spotted owls and barred owls. The larger light shaded areas are spotted owl home range, and the darker shaded area is the core area for a spotted owl, with the dots being their activity center, which is usually based on a nest site. For the barred owls, it's the open polygons and a triangle showing their activity center. There's a lot of information here, but I want you to focus on the left two panels, which is during the breeding season. The green circle shows Wolf Creek pair of spotted owls activity center in 2007, and they partially overlapped with a nearby pair of barred owls. But in 2008, that pair of spotted owls shifted their activity center to the edge of their old home range because another pair of barred owls came in and overtook their activity center. Another aspect David Wiens looked at with competition is a diet overlap, which has also been looked at by other researchers. I compiled some of his results into broad categories, and On the left, you can see for the northern spotted owl, heavily on small mammals. In our area, it's mostly dusky-footed wood rat and the Humboldt's flying squirrel are their main prey. And they do opportunistically take some birds and insects. The barred owl also takes quite a few small mammals and thus competes with the spotted owl, but it takes a wide variety of prey. Note a lot more insects, crayfish, snails, and salamanders. Those last two, snails and salamanders, would be very unusual for a spotted owl to bother with, but they make a reasonable part of barred owl prey. These are some examples of local prey taken by barred owls, courtesy of Zach Perry's, including lizards, rough-skinned newts, and small owls. It's likely this is a foot of a screech owl. It was found in a stomach of one of the barred owls that was removed last year. As I mentioned, hybridization has been quite uncommon. Kelly et al. Summarized hybrids that had been observed in Oregon and Washington between 1974 and 1999. Only 25 adult hybrids were known during that period. In our study, Northwest California, we detected about 5 hybrids since 1994. So fairly uncommon. However, they can occasionally, there can occasionally be mixed species pairs. The crews at Hoopa have documented 2 mixed species pairs near Hoopa over the last decade, both of them producing hybrid young. With the spotted owl population continuing to decline in many areas, it's possible to see more mixed species pairs as spotted owls have fewer options for finding a mate. This is a male hybrid located by a Forest Service crew in 2020. Note the combination of spotted owl and barred owl breast pattern as compared to a typical spotted owl. Might be able to tell in these pictures. Also, barred owls have a lighter facial disc than spotted owls, and the hybrids tend to be kind of in between. So on this hybrid, it's a little lighter than typical spotted owl. The Northwest California demographic study included the Willow Creek study area outlined in the center of this map. That was started in 1985 by Alan Franklin, working under Rocky Gutierrez. And also a regional study area started in 1987 that included clusters of owl territories throughout the region. I'll be focusing on the Willow Creek study area for trends in the owl populations because we're doing consistent barred owl monitoring on that study area. So this is kind of the heart of the story, trends in the spotted owls and the barred owls. This graph shows the number of spotted owls annually in a solid blue line, and then overall average change based on modeling in the dashed line, which line up pretty well. The number of estimated spotted owl sites on the Willow Creek study area is shown in red, in the red solid red line, and the number of spotted owl sites that had barred owl detections is shown in the dashed line. That dashed line is often higher because a pair of barred owls could often be detected in more than one spotted owl site. But there's an overall decline in the spotted owl numbers. Especially after around 2010, there was a sharp decline. And that corresponds pretty well with the increase in barred owl detections we were getting. There we go. The barred owl invasion was aptly called a conservation conundrum by Rocky Gutierrez back in 2007 when it became apparent that barred owls were increasing in population and likely impacting the northern spotted owl. He proposed that only through experiments removing barred owls could we determine if they were actually a cause of the spotted owl decline. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service carefully set up a study to examine the impact of the barred owl. They spent 3 years developing environmental impact statement. They hired an ethicist and invited all interested parties, including the National Audubon Society and animal rights groups, to participate in discussions. Basic design of that experiment included 4 pairs of study areas with treatment on one area where barred owls were removed, and in control areas where barred owls were simply monitored along with the spotted owls. That included, in California, barred owl removals on the Hoopa Reservation, and the Willow Creek study area acted as a control for that. For the overall meta-analysis, the Green Diamond pilot study with barred owl removals was also included. I'd like to point out that this was a very unusual experiment, not only for the scope across the range of the northern spotted owl, but for dealing with related predators. It has been much more typical for removals to be of invasive species that prey on native species. So dealing with 2 competing predators is a very interesting situation. Looking at some details of barred owls removed on the Hoopa Reservation, I'd like to point out that the biologists maximized information obtained from the barred owls. Samples were taken for several research goals, including genetics and diet studies, and quite importantly, exposure to rodenticide, which I will get into a little later in the talk. The number of barred owls removed annually was fairly consistent. And after 2015, almost all of the barred owls detected and removed were subadults, indicating that they were likely not nesting. They did see a few peak years with more barred owls removed. In 2020 and 2022, more barred owls were removed in the spring than in other years, which I think indicates a higher recruitment from barred owls nesting the year before. Last year, they removed quite a few more, and when I talked with Mark Higley about that, he said one reason was with the dry fall weather we had, they could get out in the field more nights than they did in other years. He also speculated that recent fires may have caused barred owls to move around more. Whoa. There we go. So looking at trends of the owls on Hoopa, you can see a fairly similar pattern to the Willow Creek study area. This graph is a little different, showing the percent of spotted owl territories with spotted owl pairs in red. And in blue is the percent of spotted owl territories that had barred owl detections. You can see a general decline in the spotted owl occupancy, with a very large decline between 2009 and 2013, following a big increase in the number of barred owl detections. However, following initiation of barred owl removals, there was a drop in the number of barred owls they were detecting, but there was still a fair number. But fortunately, the spotted owl occupancy seemed to stabilize and then started increasing, which is what we were hoping to see. This is a summary of barred owls removed at different periods in the study areas. Note that when Hoopa started removing barred owls, they were removing quite a few more than Green Diamond did during their pilot study. And that's likely because Green Diamond started earlier when there was fewer barred owls in the area. Green Diamond took a break for about 5 years, but then they initiated barred owl removals again, and they started removing quite a few more. That number is much higher than on Hoopa because in 2020 they started barred owl removals across their whole ownership, which is quite a bit larger than Hoopa. And most recently, Zach Peary's research group was able to start removing barred owls on the Willow Creek study area and Six Rivers National Forest starting in the fall of 2023. And in a little bit over a year, they've already moved a little over 100 barred owls. So somewhat similar to what has been going on in Hoopa. This is a summary of some of the results from the barred owl experiment meta-analysis, showing estimated survival rates, recruitment into the population, and an overall population change. The red lines indicate results from removal areas, and the blue lines from control areas. And for both Hoopa and Green Diamond, you can see in the removal area, once they started removing barred owls, survivals appeared to be higher, as well as the population rate of change. The lower graphs indicate the mean effect size that was found, where 0 would mean there was no effect of barred owl removal. For parent survival, it was a clear positive effect of barred owl removal. For recruitment, there was a slight positive effect, but very small. But the rate of population change also had a clear positive effect. The overall results across all 5 study areas indicated that the spotted owl population stabilized where barred owl was removed, with an overall average decline of only 0.2%, so very stable, versus a sharp decline in areas where barred owls were not removed, with over 12% decline. The barred owl management strategy has several goals, but it only addresses the barred owl threat. It is intended to be complementary to management of spotted owl habitat. It includes a set of recommendations for management, providing framework for both agencies and private entities such as landowners. Those opting to do barred owl management must obtain permits, follow strict protocols, and monitor barred owls as outlined in the strategy. And the methods are designed to minimize the number of barred owls in a specific management area to help the spotted owls. Remove barred owls humanely and pose little risk to non-target species. The strategy prioritizes areas to focus management with fairly large general management areas, smaller focal management areas, and where appropriate, spotted owl site management. These are examples of management areas in our area. The strategy identifies the North California coast, outlined in blue, and the Northwest California Klamath region, a little more convoluted outline, as areas for management, and considers both of them high priority due to both the long-term research and knowledge about spotted owls in the area, as well as locally viable populations of spotted owls that have good prospects for recovery with barred owl removal. With the long-term research and recent barred owl removals, I would say both HUPA and the Willow Creek study area make prime areas to focus barred owl management. I'd like to talk a little bit about the ethics of wildlife management in relation to the barred owl management strategy. As I mentioned, the Fish and Wildlife Service established a barred owl stakeholders group to discuss the issues. They included 40 representatives from various government agencies, Native American tribes, the forest product industry, and animal welfare groups to help identify and respond to ethical issues involved with the proposed removal experiment and management strategy. This was the first time that an ethics review was ever conducted as part of wildlife management in the United States. And hopefully sets a good precedent for including ethics in such management. As part of that effort, they hired an ethicist to lead the review, and he identified three primary perspectives from the discussions. One, a crisis for northern spotted owls is at hand. Act accordingly. Note, this is back in 2011. Use the most humane and continue to non-lethal method alternatives. And three, establish endpoints for the removal experiment and future management actions. For those interested in learning more about that, Dr. Lin, who is his ethicist, published a paper in Society and Animals. Other species have invaded western states from the eastern US. Jack Dumbacher and Alan Franklin discussed the issue in a recent article. Along with the barred owl, they used the blue jay as an example. Here again shows detections of blue jays in different decades. And back in the 50s, there was a few detections of barred owls in, say, Colorado. And in the 70s, blue jays first started turning up on the West Coast, but still very low numbers. While the impacts of blue jays on Western birds are unknown, they are nest predators, and they have been implicated in local exportation of endangered warblers populations. In this article, the authors discuss the ethical considerations of lethal removal of barred owls, that difficult choices have to be made to protect the spotted owl, and that delays dealing with other native invasive species will result in similar predicaments that we're facing. I'd like to quickly address some other threats that spotted owls face. One is rodenticide exposure. Gabrielle et al. Took advantage of barred owls collected on Green Diamond to look for rodenticide, and they found 40% had been exposed to rodenticide. They also had access to 10 spotted owls that had been found opportunistically, and 7 of the 10 had been exposed to rodenticide. On Hoopa, overall, about 2/3 of barred owls that they tested had been exposed to rodenticide, with females generally having higher rates of exposure. The levels of rodenticide do not indicate a cause of mortality, but it's unknown what effect lower doses might have. With females having higher exposure rates, it's possible that could have an impact on their reproductive rates. An interesting case study in 2017, a female that had recently deceased was found on our study. It is incredibly rare to find deceased adult spotted owls in the field. This is the only case where we found a freshly deceased adult owl in the field. On the map, the star indicates where the female is located within her core area. This red triangle indicates an illegal trespass cannabis grow, and the other red polygons indicate cannabis grows on private lands. It's assumed that spotted owls and barred owls are exposed to rodenticide through their prey, such as wood rats. Another factor that has effect on spotted owls is fire, which we've seen plenty of in the last decade. Jeremy Rockwhite looked at the data with a variety of fires to look at survival rates and recruitment. And he found when there are fairly low fire severity, and in this example, the dark green is unburned, the light blue is a low severity burn, yellow is moderate burn, and the red is high severity. The picture is in one of our sites on the Willow Creek area that had a lower to moderate severity burn, where the understory was partially burned, but the overstory was left intact. And in fact, there's a spotted owl perched in one of those trees.
Oh, wow.
So they will use bird areas if it's not too severe. Come on. With more moderate to high severity burns, we found that there's reduced survival but increased recruitment, indicating there's a higher turnover of spotted owls on a site. That's not necessarily good for the long-term prospects because the owls have to learn the area. And with very high severity burns, found a larger reduction in survival and a loss of nesting and roosting habitat. This is an example on one of the owl sites we monitored that had a high severity burn. You can see not only is the understory completely burned, but the understory was also burned as well. There can be synergistic effects in that the impacts of barred owls may exaggerate other threats. For instance, barred owls reducing the prey base may force spotted owls into more marginal habitat, making them having to forage farther and maybe have a higher probability of being exposed to rodenticide. And with increasing severity of fires, reduction in nesting habitat, and barred owls can outcompete the spotted owls for that nesting habitat. Finally, I want to point out that this situation is not all about the spotted owl. Barred owls are likely having a negative impact on many other species, as well as the forest ecosystem as a whole. Holm et al. Published in 2016 about barred owl trophic cascades. This diagram indicates the potential complex interaction between barred owls and a variety of prey and the ecosystem. Whereas with the spotted owl focusing mostly on, in our area, wood rats and flying squirrels, have a less impact on the overall system. So in summary, barred owls are clearly having an impact on northern spotted owls with competition for resources, but they are only one of several stressors that spotted owls are facing. Those include increased fire severity and rodenticide use in forested areas. Barred owls are an immediate threat that need to be addressed to allow northern spotted owl populations to continue for the foreseeable future. Thank you, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Yes.
When they do removals, do they consider hybrids for removal, or they leave them there?
So hybrids are not necessarily targeted for removal, but under the current management strategy, it's allowed to remove them.
Sort of 50-50. They're not targeting them, but if they happen to remove them, it's okay.
Right. Like I said, in this area, they've been very uncommon, and that's true going north. In the Sierra Nevada, they were finding more hybrids than we typically would see around here. And we think that's because by the time barred owls started getting in Sierra Nevada, the number of spotted owls there had already declined lower. So. Yes.
I just want to be clear about terminology. When you say removal, you mean kill them, right?
Almost all of them have been killed. For the removal experiment, there were a few that were captured to be donated to specific places. Prior to the experiment, Fish and Wildlife Service contacted, I think, literally hundreds of organizations, including zoos and such throughout the US, and found hardly anybody that wanted to take any.
Isn't there some kind of a, I don't know, network where, like, let's say there was a country that was overrun with rats, you could send all those owls over there?
Interesting idea. But there's a general consensus that shooting the barred owls is the most humane way to deal with them. Capturing and moving an owl is very traumatic, and many of them may not survive that kind of treatment. So most people will agree that it is most humane just to quickly shoot them.
Do you, before you remove them, do you like make sure they don't have offspring and a mate?
So during the removal experiment, that was the case. They had to basically be sure, either by the time of the year or other methods, that they didn't have dependent young. For the barred owl management strategy, they decided to adopt that requirement because of the difficulties that can lead to. That certainly was one of the concerns of, say, like the animal rights groups prior to doing the experiment.
Will they continue to remove the bar owls then, so that the spotted owls?
So the barred owl management strategy was accepted as of, I think, about 5 months ago. With the intention that, say, agencies would begin this spring with working under that strategy. I just saw in the news yesterday that the BLM in Oregon has signed off accepting that they will follow the strategy on BLM lands in Oregon. So another hand.
Is there any research being done on the temperament of the hybrids or anything as far as like their impact?
The impact of the hybrids?
Yeah, the hybrids,
I mean, in terms of,
like them in specific.
I mean, in observations I've had, and along with some other biologists I know, the hybrids generally act a little more like the barred owl, and so will have similar competition and interference. One thing that has been noted by at least a couple biologists I know is that there's been cases where have a spotted owl male and a barred owl female that made up for maybe 2 or 3 years. Barred owl female was removed, and then a spotted owl female came in and got back to a full spotted owl pair, which I thought was interesting. Yes.
So what is our like estimated local population? How many northern spotted owls do we think are out there or known pairs?
Great question. I mean, we certainly know a lot more about the spotted owls, but our best information is from specific areas like Hoopa, the Willow Creek Study Area. Fish and Wildlife Service did an estimate for, across the landscape. And their estimate for 2023 was roughly 3,500 pairs of northern spotted owls across the range, with about 70% of those in California. That's why our area is put out as a high priority for doing barred owl management.
If I could follow up on that, the macro level, is there 7,000 or 8,000 northern spotted owls in the Northwest? I've seen estimates we'd have to kill 100,000 barred owls. Is that within reason?
What the estimate is under the management strategy, if it is executed to its full extent, is that roughly, I remember, I think it's roughly across the range for the northern spotted owl, roughly trying to remember the numbers. But it is in the thousands each year, with the overall and for the management strategy, Fish and Wildlife Service put it together for 30 years with the idea that it's going to take a long time for spotted owls to start recovering, especially in Oregon and Washington. And across the 30 years, it's close to 450,000. However, on an annual basis, their best estimate is that would be somewhere around 15% of the barred owls in the Pacific Northwest each year. So would not have a very big impact on this barred owl population. It's definitely a vague estimate on the number of barred owls out there, but they estimated in the areas where they're proposing to do barred owl management, currently about 50,000 barred owls. And that population will keep growing without some management.
Can I ask one more,
Oh, sure.
this is sort of philosophical. At what point do you determine that the spotted owl's in trouble? I'm thinking of another example, like great white sharks eating sea otters. Is there some point when we know, this is the point you gotta intervene?
Oh, we passed that point.
We passed that.
We have passed that point. Yes. I mean, you saw,
You take one species, or what about the otters or sea lions eating salmon? Do we pick which one to focus on?
those are great questions. Part of it is our laws with the Endangered Species Act. So the Fish and Wildlife Service has an obligation to do what they think is best to protect the spotted owl because it's a listed species. And that goes for, for other ones as well. But I saw a hand in the back there.
Yes. I was wondering, do you think it'd be beneficial for them to allow the public to hunt these barred owls, or should the government agencies just keep doing it themselves?
For the public to go out?
Yes.
And no, that would not be a good idea. As has been pointed out, without good training, people could get confused, especially at night, around the species. And in the strategy, they outline the requirements that somebody has to, go through specific training and with somebody that is already an expert at removing barred owls. So these are only going to be trained people out there doing that kind of removal.
On that note, could you put up the picture of both the bar owl and the spotted owl?
Sure.
Kind of back to it.
There's one.
No.
So there's an example.
Okay, so the top one.
On a quick look, I mean, so the barred owl is a little bit larger, but if you're just seeing one bird, that's hard to judge. The things I key in is the breast pattern, and the facial disc. As you can see here, the facial disc is definitely more distinct on the barred owl. The spotted owl tends to have more like what people refer to as a white X.
The top one's is spotted, right?
The top one's a spotted, yes. For the removal experiment, they were, they highly recommended or required both vocal and visual confirmation of what the bird was. And most people would want to get a frontal view of the bird to determine if it's a barred owl or not. From the back, they look even more similar.
Is there any reason why there's more rodenticide in the female population than there was in the male population?
Well,
Or any circulation?
it's a good question. One possibility is, when they're thinking about nesting, going through courtship behavior or actually nesting, it's very common in spotted owl, and I assume it's fairly common in the barred owl for the male to be hunting and giving prey to the female. So that's one possibility, but I'm not sure why. Okay.
So thank you. We really appreciate you sharing that perspective. You've been in these forests. It's a great place to stop here for over 30 years, watching these populations and seeing them decline. So I guess if you could maybe just share a little bit about your experiences just watching this happen?
Oh, my,
Interesting to.
well, I will say, you know, I trained as an ecologist in college. And so as an ecologist, it's been very interesting to watch this competition happen. It's an interesting development, but it also has been surreal. I actually worked with barred owls back in Illinois in the 80s, in the same year that Alan started the study on the Willow Creek study area. So yeah, the barred owls are amazing birds. They're interesting to watch. And it's great to see them back east where they belong. But seeing the impact they're having now after having worked with spotted owls for 3 decades is very surreal. It really is. Joe.
Do the hunt at night, Michigan? Is that a hunt at night or it's during the day too?
For removing them? That is most common, yeah. They don't necessarily have to, but they'll often go out close to sunset to start, and they basically are surveying for them and seeing that you get detections.
Well, maybe we can take one more, but
One more?
it is a little bit after 8,
Yeah.
so we are gonna have to
Okay.
cut off the questions.
One more?
Yeah, if you wanna have.
I'm sure just with the trends in high severity wildfires in the Pacific Northwest and loss of spotted owl habitat and the recent changes in administration, what do you foresee as far as the future, as far as changes in increase, clear-cut harvesting on, potential federal lands and with wildfires, doesn't sound like it bodes well for the spotted owl.
No, it doesn't. In Oregon, was it a couple years ago, there was several large fires, and I know that took out a lot of spotted owl habitat. I mean, looking at fires in the next few years, it's hard to say because a lot of areas have already burned. So it's possible that, we won't see the big destructive fires as much in the next few years. Plus, had a very wet winter. As far as timber harvesting, that's people been trying to protect areas with spotted owls for decades, and I'm hopeful that will continue. I mean, the laws are on the side of protecting those areas.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.